Okay, let's unpack this. We're doing a deep dive today into, well, a really pivotal period in India's political history. We're using this stack of articles and analysis you provided, focusing on the years starting around 1989, a time of complex, often controversial, and deeply transformative developments.
Absolutely. And these readings, they really emphasize how difficult this era was to, foresee or even fully understand at the time, marked by deep conflicts, things happening that weren't really expected.
Right. So our mission here is to kind of pull out the most important insights from this material, the key things that help explain how the political landscape you see today was really forged back then.
Mm-hmm. Making sense of this period is crucial if you want to grasp the present. The sources even hint at the sheer unpredictability, the turbulence. There's mention of a cartoon that captured the political chaos perfectly.
Yeah, sounds like a roller coaster.
Yeah.
It was definitely a time of dramatic, sometimes jarring shifts.
It really was.
So let's set the scene a bit. The sources point to a big shift after Rajiv Gandhi's huge win in '84. But as the '80s ended and the '90s began, 5 key developments converged. Things that had a really long-lasting impact.
Yeah, like 5 distinct threads, you could say, pulling Indian politics in completely new directions.
And these threads really did reshape everything. So we'll pull on each one. First, the defeat of the Congress Party in the 1989 elections.
Yeah.
That was huge.
Massive. Then second, the rise of what became known as the Mandal issue.
Okay.
A really radical turn in economic policy.
Liberalization.
Yeah. And fourth, a series of events culminating in the demolition of the disputed structure at Ayodhya. And tied to that, the rise of Hindutva politics.
A very contentious period. And finally, the 5th thread.
The assassination of Rajiv Gandhi in May 1991.
Wow. That's a series of seismic events.
Yeah.
Any one of those would be significant on its own.
Exactly.
Okay, let's pull on that first thread then. The Congress defeat in '89 and what it meant.
Well, this was truly crucial. Congress went from, 415 seats in '84 down to just 197 in '89. A massive drop.
Huge.
And these articles argue this really marked the end of what political scientists called the Congress system dominance. Now, Congress obviously remained important, even ruled for periods after '89, but it lost that central, almost default position it held.
So, if they lost their majority, but were still the biggest party, how did a government even form then? Did they try?
Well, no single party had a majority. And interestingly, Congress, despite being the largest, chose to sit in opposition. So this led to the formation of the National Front government.
The National Front, who was in that?
It was mainly an alliance of the Janata Dal and some other regional parties. But here's the fascinating part. It got external support from 2 groups that were politically poles apart.
Oh.
The BJP on one side and the Left Front on the other. They didn't join the government, but their outside support allowed it to actually form and function, at least for a while.
That sounds like a political high-wire act from day one. How long could something like that last?
Well, as the material explains, this precarious setup really kicked off what's called an era of coalition governments at the center. Basically, from 1989 right up until 2014, no single party managed to get a clear majority on its own in the Lok Sabha.
2.5 decades of coalitions. Wow.
Yeah. And during this whole stretch, regional parties became incredibly important. They were crucial in actually forming these ruling alliances.
So they held the balance of power.
Often, yes. The readings list several examples. You had the National Front in '89, the United Front governments in '96 and '97, then the NDA coalitions in '97, '98, '99, and the UPA governments in 2004 and 2009, all built on alliances involving regional players.
So regional voices suddenly had immense power nationally. They became kingmakers, essentially.
Precisely. And the sources connect this to longer trends, sections breaking away from Congress since the late 60s, the rise of regional parties after '77. These things weakened Congress, but didn't let anyone else just step in and dominate nationally, hence the coalitions.
But that pattern eventually changed, didn't it?
It did. It's important to note, the material points out the shift more recently. In the 2014 and then again in the 2019 Lok Sabha elections, the BJP actually secured a clear majority on its own. So that changed the dynamic again, breaking that long run of mandatory coalitions, at least for now.
This whole period of coalitions, it raises some big questions that the readings touch on, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Like, does this era mean coalitions are just the future norm? Or can national parties consolidate again, like we saw more recently?
Mm-hmm.
And, did these alliances mean constant compromise, maybe preventing bolder policies? These questions still feel incredibly relevant.
They really do, and they link right into the next major development. You flagged the rise of the Mandal issue.
Right. This felt like Well, like a national political awakening almost for what the sources called the backward classes.
Yes, the term OBC, other backward classes, it's an administrative category. It covers communities other than the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes who are seen as suffering from educational and social backwardness, often called backward castes.
Okay. And reservations for OBCs weren't entirely new, were they?
No, they existed in some southern states earlier, but the demand grew nationally in the late 70s. People like Bihar Chief Minister Karpuri Thakur were pushing for it.
And this national push led to a specific commission being set up, I think.
It did. The Janata Party government, back in 1978, appointed the Second Backward Classes Commission. Its job was basically to investigate backwardness, identify these backward classes, which it largely defined as backward castes, and figure out what to do.
And it was chaired by Bindeshwari Prasad Mandal.
Exactly, B.P. Mandal. He was a socialist leader from Bihar, former MP, even briefly chief minister. So the commission became widely known as the Mandal Commission.
Got it. And what was its main recommendation when it finally reported in 1980?
The big one, the really impactful one, was its recommendation to reserve 27% of seats in educational institutions and government jobs for these OBC groups.
27%. And the justification was?
It was based on their survey findings. They found a very low presence of these so-called backward castes in public services and higher education. So the 27% was meant to address that underrepresentation.
So the report came out in 1980, but the Mandal issue really exploded onto the national scene much later, didn't it? It was triggered by a specific government action.
Exactly. The spark was in August 1990. The National Front government, the same one we talked about earlier, decided to actually implement the job reservation recommendation from the Mandal report.
And that decision was hugely controversial.
Immensely. It led to widespread and often violent anti-Mandal protests, particularly across North India, a really divisive time.
Yeah, I remember reading about the sheer intensity of that period. Social unrest.
It was intense, and the decision was immediately challenged legally, going all the way to the Supreme Court in a landmark case known as the Indira case.
And the court ruled.
In November 1992, the Supreme Court essentially upheld the government's decision to implement the reservations, though there were ongoing debates and legal adjustments about criteria, like the creamy layer, afterwards.
What was the lasting political fallout from all that intensity?
Well, the sources really highlight how the whole debate, the controversy, the government's action, it significantly raised awareness among OBC communities about their collective identity. It was a powerful force for political mobilization.
So it helped them organize politically.
Absolutely. It spurred the emergence of political parties that specifically demanded better opportunities, more access to education and jobs, and crucially, a greater share of political power for OBCs. Their argument was simple. It's democratic, given they form a large part of the population but have been historically underrepresented.
And this political awakening, it wasn't just limited to the OBCs, was it? The sources also mentioned Dalit politics gaining traction around this time.
That's right. The 1980s also saw a noticeable rise in political organization among Dalits. You had the formation of BAMCF in 1978, the Backward and Minority Communities Employees Federation. They took a strong stance, advocating for political power for the Bahujan.
Bahujan meaning?
It's a term encompassing scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, OBCs, and minorities. Basically the majority population who were seen as lacking power.
And out of that movement came a major new political force, the BSP.
Yes, the Bahujan Samaj Party, the BSP. It emerged under the leadership of Kanshi Ram. The material describes him as a strong proponent of Bahujan empowerment, an astute political strategist. He saw political power as absolutely essential for achieving social equality.
And the BSP made quite an impact, particularly in UP.
It did. It started small but had a major breakthrough in Uttar Pradesh in the 1989 and 1991 elections. Its main support base initially was Dalit voters. And the sources point out this was really the first time in independent India that a party primarily backed by Dalits achieved that level of political success.
And the BSP's approach was quite pragmatic, wasn't it? Focused on numbers.
Yes, it was envisioned as being based on pragmatic politics, drawing confidence from the simple fact that the Bahujans collectively formed the majority. While Dalits were its core base early on, it did expand its reach to other social groups over time.
And how did Dalit and OBC politics interact? Were they always aligned?
Not necessarily. The sources note that often Dalit and OBC politics developed independently, sometimes even competitively, in different parts of India. They weren't always pulling in the same direction.
So these developments, Mandal and the rise of Dalit politics, They fundamentally reshape India's social and political power structures. But the material leaves us with some tough questions here too, doesn't it?
It does, really challenging ones. Like, will these changes, these reservations and political movements actually benefit all the people within these backward and Dalit groups? Or will the gains mostly go to a few dominant castes or families within those groups?
The creamy layer issue again.
Exactly. And maybe the most fundamental question. Will this focus on representation lead to genuinely better policies for the truly deprived? Or does it risk becoming just a political game about getting a share of power without necessarily delivering deeper social or economic change? Still very relevant debates today.
Absolutely. Now, you mentioned economic policy as the third key development. How exactly was the 1990s a radical turn there?
This was another huge shift, maybe less visible in terms of, street protests initially compared to Mandal or Ayodhya, but profound nonetheless. India basically hit a severe economic crisis around 1991.
A crisis? What kind?
We had a large fiscal deficit, meaning the government was spending much more than it earned, and critically, our foreign exchange reserves, the stash of foreign currency needed to pay for imports, dwindled to almost nothing. We were nearly bankrupt.
Okay, that sounds serious. So the government's response had to be drastic.
Precisely. The government, led by Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao, with Dr. Manmohan Singh as finance minister, launched a comprehensive set of economic reforms.
These are the famous 1991 reforms.
That's them. They involve things like liberalizing trade, making imports and exports easier, deregulating industries, removing lots of government controls, actively encouraging foreign investment, and starting to privatize state-owned companies.
That sounds like a complete U-turn from previous policies.
It really was a radical turn away from the more state-controlled, inward-looking economic model that India had largely followed since independence.
So not just tweaking the system, but fundamentally changing the direction of the entire Indian economy.
Exactly. And these reforms, they were met with significant debate. Lots of criticism from various groups, people worried about job losses, about rising inequality, the impact on local Indian industries suddenly facing foreign competition.
Understandable concerns. But did the reforms stick?
They did, largely. Over time, as the Indian economy started growing faster, many of these policies gained broader acceptance across the political spectrum. We'll touch on that consensus later, but at the moment they were introduced, it was a dramatic, controversial, and for many, quite worrying shift.
Okay, now let's move to those next threads, which seem intertwine the debate over secularism and the rise of politics based on religious identity, specifically focusing on the events around Ayodhya.
Yes, these are described as the third and fourth key developments kind of converging. It helps to have a bit of background on the BJP here.
Right, the Bharatiya Janata Party.
After the emergency in the 70s, the earlier version, the Bharatiya Janata Sangh, had merged into the Janata Party. When that party broke up, its former Janata Sangh members formed the BJP in 1980.
And initially, their platform was broader.
Yes, initially they tried a broader platform, even talking of abandoned socialism. But they didn't have much electoral success in the 1980 and 1984 elections. Congress swept in 84.
So, like Congress, after its 89 defeat, the BJP also felt the need to kind of reinvent itself after those setbacks.
Indeed. And after 1986, the party began to really emphasize the Hindu nationalist element in its ideology. They started actively pursuing what's called Hindutva politics as a strategy to mobilize Hindu voters.
Hindutva. Can you explain what the sources say that term means?
Sure. The material defines Hindutva literally meaning Hinduness as a concept articulated by V.D. Savarkar. He saw it as the basis of Indian nationhood. The core idea, according to this view, is that to be truly Indian, one must accept India not just as their fatherland, Pitrabhumi, but also as their holy land, Punyabhumi.
Okay.
And believers in this ideology argue that a strong nation needs a strong, unified national culture. In India, they believe that culture is primarily provided by Hindu culture. That's the essence of it, as presented in the sources.
And these readings highlight two specific developments around 1986 that became absolutely central to this strategic shift by the BJP and the rise of Hindutva politics.
Yes, two key events. The first was the Shah Bano case in 1985.
Shah Bano, what happened there?
It involved a 62-year-old divorced Muslim woman named Shah Bano who went to court seeking basic maintenance from her ex-husband. The Supreme Court ruled in her favor, citing standard criminal law procedures.
Always seems straightforward.
Well, many Orthodox Muslims saw it differently. They viewed the Supreme Court ruling as interference in Muslim personal law, which covers family matters like marriage, divorce, inheritance, and which they felt should be governed by religious codes, not state courts. There was significant protest.
And how did the government respond?
The Congress government, under Rajiv Gandhi, responded by passing a new law in 1986, the Muslim Women Protection of Rights on Divorce Act. This act effectively overturned the Supreme Court's judgment in the Shah Bano case.
And the reaction to that law?
It was heavily criticized. Women's groups, many liberal and progressive Muslim groups, intellectuals, they all opposed it fiercely. And the BJP seized on this. They strongly criticized the government's action, framing it as appeasement of the Muslim minority, arguing it prioritized minority sentiments over gender justice and uniform civil laws.
That controversy definitely deepened existing divides, didn't it?
It certainly did. The second, and arguably even more explosive development, revolved around the Ayodhya dispute.
The Babri Masjid site?
Yes. The material outlines the long-standing dispute over the Babri Masjid, a mosque built in the 16th century by Mir Baqi, one of Babur's generals. It stood at a site in Ayodhya that some Hindus believe is the exact birthplace of Lord Rama, and they claim a temple was demolished to build the mosque.
And this dispute had been simmering for a long time.
For decades, even centuries. But in modern times, the site had actually been locked up since the late 1940s because the ownership and status were under legal dispute in the courts.
Okay, so it was locked, pending court decisions. What changed?
A critical moment came in February 1986. The Faizabad District Court ordered the locks on the Babri Masjid premises to be opened, specifically to allow Hindus to offer prayers at the site, where idols had been placed back in 1949.
And opening the locks, that escalated things dramatically.
Massively. As soon as the locks were opened, mobilization just exploded on both sides. Various Hindu and Muslim organizations started actively mobilizing their communities. This transformed what had been a long-standing but somewhat contained local dispute into a major national issue, really ratcheting up communal tensions across the country.
And the BJP, as part of its Hindutva strategy, made this dispute a core issue.
Absolutely. They made the demand for a Ram temple at the site a major political and electoral plank. They joined forces with organizations like the RSS, Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, and the VHP, Vishva Hindu Parishad, in large-scale symbolic programs and mobilizations.
Like the Rath Yatra.
Exactly. The material specifically mentions the huge Rath Yatra, or chariot journey, undertaken by L.K. Advani from Somnath in Gujarat to Ayodhya. These large-scale mobilizations created what the sources describe as a surcharged atmosphere and led to many instances of communal violence in various parts of India,
which tragically culminated in the demolition itself.
On December 6, 1992, organizations supporting the construction of a temple at the site organized a Karseva, meaning voluntary service, in Ayodhya. Thousands of people gathered. Now, the Supreme Court had explicitly ordered the state government of Uttar Pradesh, which was run by the BJP at the time, to ensure that the disputed structure was not endangered.
But that order wasn't followed.
No. Despite the Supreme Court order and assurances given by the state government, the large crowd overwhelmed the security arrangements and proceeded to demolish the mosque over several hours.
The aftermath, as you mentioned earlier, was devastating.
It was. News of the demolition triggered immediate and widespread clashes between Hindus and Muslims across India. The material specifically highlights the terrible violence in Mumbai in January 1993, which lasted for over 2 weeks and caused significant loss of life and destruction of property.
And the political fallout was immediate, too.
Yes. The BJP state government in Uttar Pradesh was dismissed by the central government almost immediately. Other BJP-ruled state governments were also dismissed soon after, and a case for contempt of court was filed against the then Chief Minister of UP, Kalyan Singh, for failing to uphold his promise to the Supreme Court to protect the structure.
And the material includes that powerful quote from the Supreme Court judgment on the contempt case, right?
It does. Chief Justice Venkatakalya and Justice G.N. Ray wrote that the proceedings had the echo of the disastrous event that ended in the demolition. They talked about the loss of thousands of innocent lives, the property damage, and critically, the damage to India's image internationally as a tolerant nation being impaired.
Quite a strong statement from the court.
Very strong. They said that while they were unhappy about convicting a leader, it has to be done to uphold the majesty of law. They found the chief minister guilty of contempt because, as they put it, the events raised larger issues which affect the very foundation of the secular fabric of our nation. He received a token sentence of 1 day's imprisonment.
That quote really does hammer home the perceived gravity of the event and its implications for India's foundational principles, like secularism.
Absolutely. The BJP, it should be noted, officially expressed regret over the demolition afterwards. The central government also appointed a commission, the Lieberhan Commission, to investigate the sequence of events leading up to it.
But the demolition itself triggered a massive debate across the country, didn't it?
A huge, crucial debate. Most political parties strongly condemned the demolition, calling it a direct attack on the principles of secularism enshrined in the Indian Constitution. It really forced a fundamental question into the open. Was India heading towards becoming a country where the majority community's sentiments would dominate? Or would it continue to uphold the principle of equal protection of the law and equal citizenship rights for people of all religions?
A core question about the nature of the Indian state.
Exactly. And the material connects this to the broader ongoing debate about using religious sentiments and symbols for political or electoral mobilization.
It wasn't the first time communal tensions flared, sadly.
No. The sources point out the challenges to communal harmony had been present before, citing the tragic anti-Sikh riots in 1984 as an earlier example. And they also mention the violence in Gujarat in 2002, mainly targeting the Muslim minority community, as another instance of large-scale communal violence that they describe as a serious threat to democracy.
It's important, as you said, to remember, we're reporting what the sources describe here, the events, the reactions, the debates they sparked. These were, and remain, highly complex and controversial issues.
Precisely. The focus here is on understanding the political impact and the nature of the debates as presented in the materials we're looking at.
Okay, so we've covered the end of Congress dominance, the rise of coalitions, the impact of Mandal and Dalit movements, the huge economic shift, and these intense debates around secularism, Ayodhya, and Hindutva politics. That's 4 massive, sometimes conflicting forces. What was the 5th thread you mentioned?
The 5th key development, tragically, was the assassination of Rajiv Gandhi in May 1991. He was killed by an LTTE suicide bomber during the election campaign.
How did that specific event impact the political landscape of this already turbulent period?
Well, it might not have initiated a new political trend in quite the same way as Mandal or Ayodhya did, but his assassination was deeply significant. Symbolically and practically, it marked an endpoint to the near-continuous leadership of the Congress Party by someone from the Nehru-Gandhi family for decades.
Right. He was the prime minister who'd won that massive 1984 victory.
Exactly. And his death removed a central, very prominent figure from the political scene right at this moment of intense transition and uncertainty. The economic reforms were just being debated and launched. The Mandal issue was still raw. The Ayodhya movement was gaining momentum. His absence was deeply felt.
So it removed a key player and perhaps underscored the end of that particular era of Congress dominance.
It certainly added another layer of profound change and profound loss to an already churning period. The sources frame it as one of those key events that, together with the others, ensured that the politics after 1989 would be fundamentally different from what came before.
Okay, so we have these 5 powerful, sometimes contradictory forces, all reshaping India simultaneously. You'd almost expect constant chaos, gridlock, maybe total instability.
You might think so. And there certainly was a lot of competition and conflict, tough electoral battles, especially between Congress and BJP, a very fragmented party system for a long time, as we discussed. But here's the really surprising outcome that the material points to, emerging during this very period of conflict and churning. Despite everything, a kind of broad, often unspoken agreement started to emerge among most of the major political parties on certain crucial issues.
A consensus?
Yeah.
Really? Out of all that turbulence, that does sound counterintuitive. How did that happen, according to these sources?
It's one of the key takeaways, one of the most interesting observations about this period. While parties were fighting fiercely on the surface, often for power, a consensus quietly formed, or maybe solidified, underneath it all on 4 key points.
Okay, what were those 4 elements of this surprising consensus?
First, agreement on the new economic policies. Despite the initial opposition and some ongoing criticism from certain groups, like labor unions or farmers groups, most political parties eventually came around to broadly supporting the economic reforms, started, arguably, under Rajiv Gandhi, but really implemented from 1991 onwards.
So liberalization became the accepted path forward. more or less.
Yeah, the general belief, as the sources describe it, settled across the spectrum that these policies were necessary for prosperity, for economic growth, and for boosting India's status as a rising economic power globally.
Okay, that's one. What's the second element?
Second, acceptance of the political and social claims of the backward castes. After the whole Mandal churn, pretty much all parties came to recognize the validity of OBC claims for representation.
So Mandel fundamentally changed the baseline assumptions.
It really did. Now, parties across the board generally support reservations for OBCs in education and government jobs. And there's a widespread acceptance that OBCs need and deserve a share of political power that reflects their large population size.
That's a huge shift. The third element.
Third, acceptance of the crucial role of state-level parties in national governance. The coalition era really cemented this. The distinction between state parties and national parties became much blurrier. State-based parties weren't just regional players anymore. They became essential partners in forming governments and sharing power at the center throughout this period and beyond.
They became indispensable components of national power structure.
Exactly. And the fourth element of the consensus. It's about pragmatism over ideology, especially when forming governments.
How so?
Coalition politics, by its very nature, shifted the focus. Instead of rigid ideological purity, the emphasis often became about practical power-sharing arrangements needed to actually form a stable government and run it.
Can you give an example from the sources?
Yeah, the classic example given is the NDA coalition government led by Atal Bihari Vajpayee from 1998 to 2004. Many of the coalition partners in the NDA did not subscribe to the BJP's core Hindutva ideology. Some were explicitly secular parties, yet they came together based on a common minimum program, formed a government, and importantly, managed to complete a full 5-year term.
That really highlights how the practical need to gain and hold power could trump deep ideological differences, at least in forming alliances.
Precisely. These four elements, agreement on economic policy, acceptance of backward caste claims, role of state parties, and pragmatic alliances represent a significant shift from the more ideologically driven politics you might have seen in earlier decades.
And the material provides some updates beyond that core period, right? Mentioning later elections.
Yes, it briefly brings things forward, noting the 2004 election where Congress returned to power leading the UPA coalition, which was supported externally by the left front. Then the UP won again in 2009, continuing that coalition trend.
But then contrasting that with the more recent elections.
Right. Contrasting it with the 2014 and 2019 elections where the BJP won clear majorities on its own, which, as we noted, changed the necessity for coalitions, at least temporarily. The sources even include a breakdown of the party positions in the 17th Lok Sabha formed after 2019. It just shows the political landscape continues to evolve.
So these changes, described in the sources as momentous, are still shaping politics today. We've traced the shift from single-party dominance to this highly competitive multi-party system, but one that, for a long time, operated on these certain, often implicit agreements.
Exactly. And understanding these shifts, the decline of the old system, the rise of identity politics, the economic changes, the era of coalitions, and even this underlying consensus, understanding all that is absolutely key if you want to make sense of the political landscape you see in India today.
Why parties form the alliances they do, the ongoing debates about identity and representation, the direction of economic policy, the push and pull between national and regional forces, it all connects back to this crucial period.
It really does.
We've covered a huge amount of ground here. The seismic shift away from the Congress system, the powerful, sometimes volatile impact of Mandal and Ayodhya, the radical turn in the economy, the tragic loss of a leader, and then this surprising emergence of a new political consensus underneath it all.
It's clear from these readings, isn't it? The period after 1989 wasn't just a routine change of government. It fundamentally reshaped India's party system. It significantly altered its social dynamics. It forced intense debates about its secular identity, and it created entirely new economic realities.
The material also briefly touches on a tension, though, that seems to persist. A tension between the formal party politics operating within this broad consensus and the various popular movements happening outside the formal political system. Groups raising issues like persistent poverty, displacement due to development projects, demands for justice, struggles over resources and livelihoods, things that maybe don't fit neatly into that 4-point consensus.
That's a really important point the sources make. These movements often serve as reminders, holding the state accountable, raising issues that maybe the mainstream political consensus overlooks or doesn't prioritize. It adds another layer of complexity, showing that even if a consensus exists within the party system, the issues and demands bubbling up from society are constantly evolving.
So given this entire history we've explored, the intense churning, the shifting dynamics, the rise of new political forces, the complex interplay of identity and economics, and the evolution of the surprising consensus, these readings really leave us with a powerful final thought. A question really for you, the listener, to reflect on.
What's that?
What does all this history mean for the future of democratic politics in India? In this incredibly complex, constantly evolving landscape we've just described, will democracy always be able to offer truly meaningful political choices for its citizens?
That's a deep question. It really encourages you to think about everything we've discussed from the sources, this continuous churning, these tensions, these agreements, and consider how they might shape what comes next. The future of democratic politics in India, these articles seem to suggest, is still very much being written through the interplay of these very factors.